Church, in much the same way as St. Augustine had incorporated the thought of Plato into Christian doctrine 8 centuries earlier. As we have seen, before Aquinas' vast and detailed analysis of Aristotle's ideas and his relation of them to Christian ideas, Christian theology had been coming under increasing pressure from the rediscovery of Greek culture with its emphasis on reason and science. Indeed, it's difficult to see how Christian theology of the period could have survived without Aquinas' help. Summa Contra Gentiles is a philosophical work whose purpose is strictly unphilosophical. In it, Aquinas uses philosophical arguments to demonstrate the truth of Christian beliefs. His arguments are aimed at the thoughtful non-Christian. This species was generally held to be extinct in Europe during the period, and whenever such proved not to be the case, vigorous inquisitorial measures were taken to ensure that it did become the case. So who was Aquinas writing for? His imaginary reader is generally reckoned to be an intellectual Arab. After being subjected to hundreds of pages demonstrating the incontrovertible truth of the Christian religion, it is assumed that he has no alternative but to forswear Islam and embrace Christianity. How many intellectual Arabs subjected themselves to this grueling experience and reached the same conclusion is unknown. Aquinas' purpose may be suspect, but his philosophizing is of a high caliber. His arguments follow simply and logically from step to step, echoing the manner adopted in Plato's dialogues and the works of Aristotle. He likes to begin with the commonplace particular and lead, step by step, to the most profound conclusions. Take, for instance, his notion of wisdom. It is possible, he says, to achieve wisdom in some practical sphere, such as the making of money. Here the wisdom is the means employed for a particular purpose, getting rich. But all particular purposes are subsumed in the overall purpose of the world. This purpose is the ultimate truth, which is good. The highest form of wisdom thus leads us toward an understanding of this overall purpose, God's will. Those who do not accept that the ultimate purpose of the world is good may feel there is a gap in this line of reasoning, but there is no denying the leading role of reason in such argument, which Aquinas derived from Aristotle. According to Aquinas, such informed reasoning will always lead us toward God, but it can only take us so far. We can use reason to prove such things as the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, but reason is incapable of proving the existence of such things as the Last Judgment and the Holy Ghost. The existence of these can only be understood by revelation, which comes from faith. Aquinas is at great pains to differentiate between the realm of reason and that of faith. Truths that can be demonstrated by reason never contradict the truths of faith. Likewise, the truths of faith, which are discovered by revelation, are always in accord with the truths discovered by reason. Fortunately, most of Summa Contra Gentiles is devoted to the latter, and only when these reasonable arguments reach their conclusion does Aquinas point out how they accord with the truths of faith. Aquinas' classification of reason subtly clears the way for independent scientific investigation, using the methods of Aristotle. At the same time, it stresses how the conclusions drawn from such investigations are bound to agree with the tenets of faith. It gives the appearance of an equal partnership between reason and faith, but this equality is an illusion. The Church had long since made a meal of science, and in doing so it had swallowed Aristotle whole, or at least those bones of his philosophy that had survived the Dark Ages in Western Europe. Aristotle's science was now a part of the faith, and the world was made up of earth, air, fire, and water. The earth was the center of the universe, a heavy object dropped to the ground faster than a light object. Aristotle had written that such things were true, so they were true, even when anyone dropping a book and a pen at the same time could immediately see otherwise. The main difficulty for Aquinas' argument arose when Aristotle's reason was applied to the very science he had produced. Here reason and faith did come into conflict. But for the time being, this difficulty was brushed under the carpet, where it would remain for 3 centuries, until the advent of Copernicus and Galileo. Copernicus essentially used mathematical reasoning to demonstrate that the planets circled the sun. Galileo's reliance on experimental method can be seen as an extension of reason into the practical sphere. Aristotle would certainly have recognized both these as developments of the logic that he had invented. Aristotle had never intended his science to be static. He rightly saw it as a continuing process of investigation. Only the method was meant to be a permanent feature. If the Church had only distinguished Aristotle's method, reason, logic, categorization, from his findings, the conflict with science would never have arisen. Aristotle's scientific findings could then have been seen as a necessary limitation of his age, like his form of dress or his unavoidable pagan status. This is best illustrated by a conflict that didn't arise. Aristotle barely mentioned commercial practice, and thus the birth of merchant banking, which took place around this period, infringed no articles of faith, other than the Bible's edict on usury, which was cynically circumvented. Aristotle had made no pronouncements on double-entry bookkeeping or rates of interest on loans. As a result, the science of money was able to develop unhindered, to the immense profit of European civilization, and of course the bankers. But back to Summa contra Gentiles. Having cleared the ground for reason, Aquinas now set about using it for a fundamental task, proving the existence of God. Nowadays we tend to regard this as one of the things reason cannot be used to prove. The existence of God is self-evident to us, a matter of faith, or we consider the whole thing a fairy tale. No matter how compelling and reasonable the arguments, either for or against, these appear irrelevant. In other words, we now tend to consider that such things as the existence of God and the immortality of the soul fall into the realm of revelation. What is philosophically important is Aquinas' delineation of these two categories, reason, revelation, not his misapplication of them. As we have already seen, something remarkably similar to these categories still continues in modern philosophy, where Wittgenstein maintains, "Whereof one cannot speak, one must remain silent." Or, put another way, any ultimate truth, if there is such a thing, is so beyond proof that we cannot even talk about it. It is useful to adopt a similar attitude when considering Aquinas' actual proofs of the existence of God. What is interesting is not so much the conclusions as the arguments themselves, in other words, the form of such arguments. The literal-minded have every right to be suspicious at this point. Such an attitude can be highly dangerous. The form of argument used by a racist or a flat-earther may be superior to that adopted by us cosmopolitan globalists, though this doesn't make the conclusion of their argument any less preposterous. Proofs of God's existence may have passed out of fashion, but their form remains very much with us. Indeed, as we shall see, contemporary scientists now use one such form to explain the existence of the universe. Curiously, Aquinas begins by rejecting what many consider to be the most compelling proof of God's existence, namely the ontological argument, which had been formulated just over a century before Aquinas was born. The man responsible for the ontological argument was St. Anselm, an Italian monk who became Archbishop of Canterbury during the reign of William Rufus. He quarrelled with the king over some chalice covers and was exiled. Later, Henry I recalled him, but they too quarrelled, and Anselm was exiled once more. He was obviously pretty good at arguments, but the ontological argument was far and away his finest. Put very simply, this starts with an assertion with which most people would agree, even if they don't believe in God. It states that the idea of God is the greatest possible idea of which we can conceive. According to Anselm, if this idea doesn't actually exist, there must be an even greater idea exactly like it, which also includes the attribute of existence. Thus the greatest of all ideas must exist. Otherwise an even greater idea would be possible. QED. God exists. Aquinas rejected this argument on the grounds that we on earth can only gain a vague conception of the attributes of God. We can never know all of them perfectly. Thus we cannot prove whether these include existence or not. Despite being rejected by Aquinas, the ontological argument was to have a long and fascinating intellectual pedigree. 4 centuries later it was taken up by Descartes and then adopted in variant forms by both Spinoza and Leibniz. In the following century, Kant was to agree with Aquinas and reckoned he'd destroyed the ontological argument once and for all, but something very similar to it surfaces again in the philosophy of Hegel. Arguments for the existence of God may now be considered redundant, but they were to provide an element of continuity in philosophy long after it had freed itself from the straitjacket of theology, so skillfully tailored for it. Biblical arguments to demonstrate the truth of Christian beliefs. His arguments are aimed at the thoughtful non-Christian. This species was generally held to be extinct in Europe during the period, and whenever such proved non-Christian theology of the period could have survived without Aquinas' help. Summa Contra Gentiles is a philosophical work whose purpose is strictly unphilosophical. In it, Aquinas uses philosophy in much the same way as St. Augustine had incorporated the thought of Plato into Christian doctrine 8 centuries earlier. As we have seen, before Aquinas' vast and detailed analysis of Aristotle's ideas not to be the case, vigorous inquisitorial measures were taken to ensure that it did become the case. So who was Aquinas writing for? His imaginary reader is generally reckoned to be an intellectual Arab, and his relation of them to Christian ideas, Christian theology had been coming under increasing pressure from the rediscovery of Greek culture with its emphasis on reason and science. Indeed, it's difficult to see how Christian